aquí a todos, buen día, bienvenidos. Sobre todo por los cambios de último momento. No estamos en las condiciones ideales, pero estoy segura que vamos a tener un evento muy interesante y de todas formas no quiero empezar sin reconocer un poco el porqué del cambio de sede de este seminario y reconocer las muertes que ha habido en la zona de Israel y Palestina en los últimos meses, pero también en los últimos años. Sí quiero empezar a hacer ese reconocimiento y bueno, es una pena que estamos viviendo esto en el mundo, pero estoy muy contenta de que estemos aquí. Para los que nos acompañan en YouTube, bienvenidos. Para los que nos acompañan aquí también, gracias por venir. I'm sure that if you're here and we have such a crowded room, it's because you're really happy to meet with Jaime Haas and discuss kind of like the first part of the first event of today, where we're going to talk about rethinking demographic dynamics, migration and climate change. And this event is organized within the activities of the Cuerpo Académico Dinámica Demográfica, so the research group on demographic dynamics, where we at CEDUA kind of like discuss and meet regularly to think on demography and different roles of demography in everyday life, I would say, and today's life. And it's also organized jointly by the Seminario de Migración, Desigualdad y Políticas Públicas, the Seminar on Migration, Inequality and Public Policy. And I think it makes a lot of sense to actually combine the discussion today on climate change, demographic dynamics and migration. And I guess a key issue that we will discuss as well will be policies. And I like to think of policies in plural because it's on the one side population policy, economic policy, migration policy, and so this will be behind the discussion. Let me start by saying that if you're not aware, Jaime Haas is a sociologist and a demographer. He's living in Amsterdam right now, but he actually lived in Oxford for a while. He's a professor of sociology at the University of Amsterdam. Between 2006 and 2015, he was founding member and co-director of the International Migration Institute at the University of Oxford, and he's still directing the institute from abroad. So I guess you're really lucky.
It's in Amsterdam.
Oh, it's in Amsterdam? Sorry. Okay.
It's migrated.
It's migrated. I was gonna say that you're really lucky to actually be living somewhere else and have the power over an institution somewhere, but I guess it's not the case. I'm sorry. I'm sure that you've read The Age of Migration, this book, which is seminal, and like, I mean, everybody studying migration has actually read one of its many, many versions, and I don't know which version it is now, sixth version. And then later today, we're gonna present the latest book from Jaime Haas on how migration really works. And so I really invite you to continue the discussion later today. This book was published in 2023 in English, and then the Spanish version is actually going to be ready tomorrow. So we have
a few blue copies.
We have a premise, yes, we have some copies. So let's start by discussing this. I also have to say that before starting, muchas gracias a todos los que permitieron el cambio de sede, que nos ayudaron. Siempre lo doy al final, pero creo que es importante también agradecer al inicio que podamos estar acá. So Hein, welcome to this discussion, and we have a PowerPoint presentation. We'll ask you to speak loud because the camera is up there, and then we will have a 30-minute presentation or so, and then lots of time for questions. I'm sure you have lots of questions on these issues. Puedo hacerlo más grande.
I'd rather stand there so I can do the.
But the problem is the camera. So if she can change.
It is really difficult.
Really difficult?
Because
Okay.
we're going fast with the slides.
Okay, so si nos escuchan en YouTube, pueden hacer una seña en el comentario de YouTube si no se oye, por favor. ¿Sí se escucha? Okay.
Thanks a lot for the invitation. Yeah.
Can you probably
Sorry?
stand up?
The problem is I have
Oh
to.
yeah, that's true. Okay.
So if there's a
El clicker no funciona.
clicker.
Okay, go on.
So yeah, thanks for being here. I'm going to talk about the topic of I was asked to talk about a topic of linking climate change, population studies, and migration. And I'm going to highlight what is one of the myths in my book, actually, is this idea that climate change will lead to mass migration. It is one of the most favorite, I would say, progressive migration arguments that's being made in favor of combating climate change. My main argument is it's a classic case of being wrong for the right reasons. Now, you're being right for the wrong reasons. I'm turning it around because I'm as concerned about climate change as any informed person should be, I think. But to link migration, mass migration, to the idea of climate change is simply not taking into account what we know in terms of evidence about a very complex relation between environment, population, and migration. And that kind of reasoning, which seems very intuitive, like, you know, with increasing droughts, increasing environmental disasters like floods, for instance, sea level rise, more and more people will be driven away from their homes and will end up on the borders. I mean, that is a bit the narrative you hear often. That you could even hear that now already in narratives in Europe about Mediterranean migration, or the US side, people saying, these people are fleeing climate change. It sounds very tentative because it makes a link between climate change, deprivation and poverty, and migration, based on the assumption that poverty is a main driver of migration. And here is the problem. And I'm going to explain that, try to share what we know from the research on climate change, environmental change, and migration from research fields. And me, myself, I've done a lot of research on this topic. My own fieldwork, my doctoral fieldwork was in Morocco. I looked at desertification, droughts, and migration. And I discovered that the relation is way more complicated than I initially thought. And later on, I've collaborated with climate scientists, other environmental geographers to look at this topic. And the evidence is simply very complex. And to summarize the argument, there are as many reasons to believe that climate change will lead to more migration as to less migration. And again, it sounds very counterintuitive, but the main reason is that if people are very much deprived, they often don't have the means to move. And if people want to move, poor people, they only move over short distances. Long distance migration, even within countries, let alone across continents, is expensive. And that means that if climate change will lead to problems for the most vulnerable populations in the world, we talk, for instance, about peasants or fishes communities, these are the poorest people in the world in many cases, living in low-income countries. These people are more likely to get trapped because of climate change there where they are, because deprivation can prevent people from moving, which is a very different perspective on migration than the traditional sort of push-pull framework we have, because we know that the poorest of the poorest migrate less because they don't have resources, whether it's money or social resources or diplomas that help them to get visas and to migrate, and it is just costly. Anyway, this is a bit of a preamble I'm making because I want to highlight how we need to rethink more generally, using this example, the relation between population dynamics and environmental change. Well, let me start with this narrative we have about climate refugees. I would say it is a fabrication, it's a fabricated argument, the idea that climate change will lead to hundreds of millions of people crossing borders. And it's very much present in the migration threat narratives you nowadays hear in Europe and in America about how we have to fight climate change to prevent these hundreds of millions of Africans or Asians to come to Europe, or indeed from Latin America, come to the United States. It is a deceiving rhetoric. It is part of what we call the securitization of migration, the broader narrative in wealthy countries that constructs migration as a threat. Whether it's, hey, you know, the Trump kind of narratives about immigration threats, these have become very normalized in many Western countries, and this is just another spin on it. And I think it is very unfortunate, because what in a way is happening is that both the extreme right wing and people on the left who say, well, we have to combat climate change, are buying into apocalyptic scenarios about immigration. On the right, the apocalyptic scenarios about replacement theory, we're being replaced by non-white, non-Christian people who don't fit in. Unfortunately, with the best of intentions, because I don't doubt the intentions of people running those arguments, the idea that climate change will lead to mass movements of refugees of hundreds of millions across borders is a very dangerous argument because it plays exactly into the cards of those who say, oh, it is too much. There are basically too many, but most importantly, it is intellectually dishonest because the evidence shows a much more complex picture. Well, the narrative is quite old. Norman Myers, a famous environmental specialist, already predicted back in the 1990s that hundreds of millions of migrants would start to be moving because of climate change. We can also see it in reports here. Christian Aid, a UK development organization that talks about the human tide, the real migration crisis. And just a random search on the internet, you'll find many more news articles that buy into the same idea. Here on Vice News, climate change will create 1.5 billion migrants by 2050, and we have no ideas where they will go to. So an apocalyptic scenario is being created, unfortunately, on quite weak science. But I can go on. The UNHCR quite recently, earth calling. The world is already at record levels of global displacement, and climate change are forcing more and more people to flee. We need climate action now. Another UNHCR example, rising food costs, rising waters, rising temperatures, rising tensions, rising displacement. The climate change crisis is driving people from their homes, etc., etc. And it's very much linked to this idea of sea level rise, and the extreme climate events will be driving more and more people away from their home. In Africa, the idea of desertification, the expansion of the Sahara Desert will drive more and more people off their lands, and we will find those people subsequently ending up on the European border. More than that, even if you read standard media narratives, a lot of what's happening on the European border, not so dissimilar from what's happening on the Mexican-US border, is already framed by many news media and politicians as climate migration. The United Nations Environmental Programme in 2005 already published this map about climate displacement in the world. This map can no longer be found, and I'll get back to that. There is a certain movement away from these big narratives because big organizations are starting to understand things are a little bit more complex, and that also spinning this argument may actually play into the hand of extreme right-wing xenophobes that say, oh, we can't have all these people here. Is it simply getting too much? But this kind of imagery is very common. I'll skip a few more, but this is the Maldives government signing an agreement under the water to warn against their country to be flooded. So it is very dominant image. You can hear politicians, journalists from the left to the right running these arguments, and unfortunately, still quite some people in the research community as well. Now, what does the evidence say? Well, as always, a more complex picture. And to just summarize, a burgeoning migration research literature being produced by climate scientists collaborating with migration researchers, I can summarize it in a few points. Environmental factors are only one among many other migration drivers, and that already makes it so dangerous. To make a simple causal connection between an environmental change that puts more stress on people's livelihoods and migration. Because we knew people may have other resources, may have other sources of income. The idea that people living in rural areas of low and middle income countries are all totally depending on agriculture is quite a naive assumption because we know the world has moved on and many people have loss of income, and not just from agriculture. And secondly, we also know that, and it's the second point, migration is only one of the possible responses to environmental degradation. The research that has been done amongst communities living in flood-prone areas, in drought-prone areas, shows that people want to stay, do everything to stay, and people can, of course, adapt their livelihoods. So, for instance, what I've seen in Morocco is droughts can incentivize people to install irrigation equipment, which makes more economic use of water. That is another possibility. Or people can actually start to draw on other sources of income, including or not from migration. Third, what we know from the research on what happens if disaster strikes, if there's a drought, if there's a flood, that most mobility is short-term. People want to go back as soon as they can, short distance, and return are the usual responses to natural disasters and climate variability. And that leads me to the fourth point. That also means that large-scale international migration, and certainly across continents, is the least likely response to such deprivation. And the last point, which I already highlighted, and that's also something we know from research, is that the poorest and most deprived are least likely to move and get trapped into what we call involuntary immobility. And here I come back to the sort of revolution we need in thinking about migration, because migration is a resource and is an investment. If you want to move, you need certain resources. Yes, people may be motivated by deprivation, but we also know if you want to move, certain over longer distances, you need access to resources. And that is why the poorest of the poorest generally either don't move or only move over short distances. Some very good research that has been done by population geographers in sub-Saharan Africa show that a drought in Mali decreases long-distance migration, for instance, to the capital city or to neighboring countries. It may increase short-distance migration because people do want to find different livelihoods, or they may indeed flee danger, but for relatively poor people, it is not even an option. And then in wet years, when harvests were higher, more people started moving to cities. So these are the kind of paradoxes. I'm not saying this is the only story. The point is that the relation between environmental stress and leading to decreasing harvests, for instance, for small-scale peasants, there are many reasons to believe it will lead to more or less migration, and most migration is more likely to be on the short distance. The last thing I want to suggest is to trivialize the seriousness of climate change. I'm questioning the linkage with large-scale international population mobility, which is based on a wrong understanding of what actually drives migration. As the famous migration geographer Ronald Skelton has stated, migration is development. If people get access to resources, to education, to connections, infrastructure, media, more people start to move. And that is why middle-income countries have much more migration than low-income countries. And that is a big paradox. And you can couple this to the whole narrative about migration, climate change and migration, which already makes it much more questionable whether this will be the case. Now, let me now dive a little bit more into some other fundamental questions. Because another important question is what is the nature of environmental degradation? For instance, increasing flooding or desertification, increasing droughts. The critical question here is what we call attribution. To what extent are these actually caused by climate change or actually human action? And then the last question is, of course, which we already dealt with, is how will this affect migration? Am I talking loudly enough, just to check? Okay. Yeah. I tried to spare my voice a little bit for this afternoon.
No one has complained in the YouTube.
Okay, good.
He's very close. Yeah, he's close.
I'm a teacher, it helps. Yeah, so that's the attribution problem. What we see a lot nowadays is that if something goes wrong in terms of the environment, we talk about erosion, we talk about flooding, it is these days almost automatically ascribed to climate change. And of course, a particular environmental catastrophe can have multiple causes. Climate change may play a role, but it's difficult to isolate. So it gets even more complex to find out what is the role of climate change in environmental degradation, and then what is the effect of environmental degradation on migration. We have a complex of causal factors, and it makes it very tricky to make this direct connection between climate change and migration. So we have to be more critical towards these narratives. One case is Bangladesh, much cited in the literature. It is often said that more and more Bangladeshis are fleeing flooding because it's one of the lowest lying countries, together with my own country, the Netherlands, basically a river delta. And flooding has been part of the history, but the idea is, of course, that with sea level rise, flooding will get a more serious problem. And it seems a very plausible story. The question is, and these are these maps that are being produced, if we have 1 meter of sea level rise in Bangladesh, all this area will be flooded, including the capital Dhaka. It will lead to catastrophe. But we have to look at the evidence. Environmental geographers have better and better evidence about the growth and loss of coastal land in different areas in the world, thanks to satellite imagery analysis. And for instance, in the case of Bangladesh, research has revealed that more land has been gained over the last few decades than lost in Bangladesh. How is that possible? Well, I'm a geographer by training. It's called sedimentation. You perhaps know about this. We also know, and I'll get back to that, physical geography 101, but we need it in a way to gain understanding. How can river deltas grow despite sea level rise? Most river deltas in the world have grown, not decreased. One of the main exceptions is the Nile River Delta, and it is simply because the process of sedimentation, you know what happens if rivers start to flow more slowly, land is being created. That process has kept up pace with sea level rise. So the sea level has risen, but land has risen as well. It does not mean we don't have concerns for the future that accelerated sea level rise, that process of sedimentation may no longer be able to keep up with that. So there is a clear danger in the future. I don't want to trivialize it, but it is very difficult to explain contemporary migration within Bangladesh with sea level rise from that area, from that perspective. And most researchers have come to the conclusion, yeah, Bangladesh is one of those low-income countries that is rapidly urbanizing, and that rural to urban migration would have happened anyway, with or without climate change. And perhaps climate change vulnerability plays some role here, but it is certainly a very minor role. It is a process that would have already happened. It is very tempting to now everything it's all about climate change. In the case of Bangladesh, it's a very difficult case to be made. Jakarta, another city that often appears in the media, has dealt with increasing flooding, and it is true that the pace and severity of flooding in Indonesia's capital has increased rapidly, and we find it a lot in other coastal cities all around the world. Again, it is very tempting, particularly for governments, to say it's all about sea level rise. Now, the sea levels have risen, but what is the main explanation? Evidence shows of increased flooding in Jakarta. It is the sinking of the land, not the rising of the sea. In some areas of Jakarta, the land has sunk so rapidly, up to 1.5 meters over the last few decades, where there is sea level rise is a much more gradual process. How is that possible? It has everything to do with extraction of groundwater. And if you have clayey or peat soils, that will start to become more compact. And we like drainage because we avoid all sorts of diseases. It makes life in cities more pleasurable. But if you do that in coastal lands, cities will start to sink, including the building mounds. It is primarily the fact that the Indonesian government has messed up its hydrological policies in the city of Jakarta with too much extraction of groundwater than sea level rise. It explains why particularly people living in poor areas of Jakarta have seen this massive problem of land subsidence. Another issue in many, many areas around the world is that particularly people living in poor neighborhoods, their protection mechanisms for sea level rise are much worse than those for rich people. And we saw that in Hurricane Katrina, New Orleans, over 10 years ago, when the levees were really of bad quality, governments hadn't maintained them well, and the dams basically broke. We saw the same in Libya last year as well. It's a lack of maintenance, actually, that explains primarily the increased flooding hazard in quite some parts of the world. I'm again not suggesting that sea level rise doesn't play a role, but it's a minor role compared to basically environmental mismanagement by governments. And it makes it very attractive for governments to push a narrative that all these problems have because of climate change. To say, well, I've seen this in Morocco, I've lived in Morocco for years. Anything going wrong with small peasants living in dry areas in terms of really bad harvests, increasing poverty, we just put the blame on the climate. If governments mess up and don't protect vulnerable populations living in coastal areas against the consequences of their own environmental mismanagement, it is very attractive, again, to blame the climate. So, however sympathetic, and I'm not a climate change denier, on the contrary, I think it's the most serious issue facing humanity, apart from the threat of nuclear war, in the coming century. But to link it with mass migration, we have to be aware of the kind of political agendas that may be behind pushing a kind of simplistic narrative that doesn't actually understand the issue. Oh, I'm going to skip this one. It's too much. But this is basically what's happening. So sea level rise, depending on where you are in the world, is 3 to 10 millimeters a year. And then but land subsidence in some cities of the world is up to 1 meter a year. So the prime causal explanation of increased vulnerability to flooding is environmental mismanagement, and climate change is adding obviously to that threat. So on the longer term, added up, of course, sea level rise is going to be a huge issue. And governments have to take measures to protect the populations living in coastal areas from the consequences of that. But it is too easy to make a direct connection between climate change now and clear problems of increasing flooding in many coastal areas in the world. And then to make the connection to migration, it simply doesn't work that way. It is more complex. Another thing is, just look at this map. This is a map, obviously, of the Nile Valley. And the paradox is, of course, that humanity has always concentrated in those areas which were most prone to flooding. I had a student working in the Limpopo River Basin in Mozambique. It's a very fertile area in Southeast Africa. And she was interviewing small farmers because she was interested in this link between population and the environment and how flooding would affect migration. And she found out that people were not willing to go away despite the frequent occurrence of flooding, because farmers would tell her, the good land is there where the floods are. This is why we keep on coming back to those lands. And I'm a Dutchman, I'm from the Netherlands, that has a history of flooding, and that's exactly the story of my country. The lowest lying areas are the most attractive areas as well. They're the same areas that are prone to flooding. And this is a picture of the Limpopo province I was just talking about. So, and as we know, of course, flooding is a curse and a blessing because it also brings fertility and irrigation to fields. And that is, of course, a dilemma. I'm skipping a few because you get the story. So the public perception of this issue, particularly when we now talk about desertification with this image of the expanding desert. I mean, this is a relevant debate in Mexico as well, but if you go to North Africa, it's about the Sahara sort of expanding this issue. It is very much driven by apocalyptic kind of thinking. And this is not a very useful way of thinking about complex issues. Because if the apocalypse is now, we better do nothing. But if we look at the evidence, things are a bit more complex. And we have here also a sort of idea of the desert advancing and pushing away the green, fertile lands. It's a very different narrative from the flooding narrative, but again, it's this idea of this apocalypse. And this is the image of desertification that run by pastors. And again, we have a gap between the encroaching desert, the advancing walls of the desert narrative, and the reality. Again, environmental specialists, geographers, population geographers have done a lot of research, including myself, on land degradation in dryland areas. So deserts and steppes and oases. And most of their findings show, yes, we see these instances, these kind of images of a dying oasis in this case. But the main causes of those instances of degradation are more caused by human action rather than by some big long-term environmental change. Too high water extraction for urban agricultural industrial use means that water tables are going down. People can no longer, poor people, can no longer reach water for irrigation or domestic use. Lack of maintenance of agriculture and irrigation works, growing dysfunction of traditional institutions for water management, and a lack of government regulation to protect smaller farmers against water extraction power of big agribusiness. In the case of Morocco, clearly you have these traditional oases that use traditional sources. Now you have big farmers coming in, creating big farms in the desert, extracting water from the desert to grow watermelons and all sorts of other high-value products for the national and international market. And it basically means that small peasants no longer can extract water. And then you have the image of the dying oasis. And then governments again are saying, it's the climate. No, it's not the climate. It's agribusiness or tourism or urban development that is the primarily responsible factor of this problem. We have an even bigger problem if we look, for instance, at the Sahara. If we look at the evidence, actually the Sahel zone, this is the dry area in between the Sahara and the more wet tropical areas in Africa, is actually getting greener rather than less green. How could you explain that? Anyway, and last example I give is Morocco, and this is where I did my own field work in a string of oases in the south. And traditional agriculture very much looked like this. I already summarized more or less the evidence. Small irrigation channels people use to tap small sources and small rivers. Underground, very old techniques to tap into underground water tables, very sustainable techniques, very labor intensive because you have to create all these shafts that connect a tunnel that taps into the underground water tables. Very intense, but very sustainable and very ancient. Now, all these systems are tending to break down these days. Traditional irrigation, flooding land, but what we see is that those systems are gradually breaking down. And here are the watermelons I already mentioned, because it means that many people living in traditional oases no longer can access groundwater, and here you have the dying oasis. And it's very tempting to say this is all about climate change, and this is why people are leaving. People were already leaving from those rural areas for many reasons, but in this particular case, it has actually been caused by overpumping and industrial and big business agrarian overuse of water. The creation of new farms in the desert has actually driven small peasants out of business. And even smaller people who tried to pump water couldn't access more water. They didn't have resources to dig deeper and to install more powerful pumps. So they no longer could access water. So I'll leave this one for what it is. It's a bit too much. Because am I in the 30 minutes already?
Okay, yeah.
How much do I have, Sue?
We have like 5 minutes left.
Great. To summarize this, what can we say from impacts of environmental stress and human mobility? Just one preamble. Of course, we cannot say anything for sure about the future. Climate change can get worse, can accelerate. There may be dangerous tipping points. The point is more to say we have to be critical towards a very simple causal thinking of we have climate change here and this will lead to X outcome in migration. Unfortunately, this is the way most climate migration forecasts are working. I don't know whether you're aware of this report by the World Bank called Groundswell that is predicting hundreds of millions of people to move within countries, some cross countries. I've written to the authors and I've asked them about, because there were a lot of predictions and maps about numbers of people being driven out of their native areas because of climate change, but there was no clarity in the report about the parameters that were used to inform their models. So I wrote to the authors, is this going online? Oh, okay. I wrote to the authors, and what I found problematic is that there was no transparency about the model. For those who are into modeling, there was no evidence on the parameters that went into their models. And that I think is problematic. What I could deduce from the report is that they apparently assumed that an X decrease in rainfall will lead to a Y increase in migration. And that is tricky because of the evidences I already mentioned. There is no simple causal connection between whatever climate change factor and migration. There are as many reasons to think it can lead to less or more migration, very dependent on the local context, very dependent on the resources people have, very much dependent on what governments can do also to protect people, to enable them to stay. It is very difficult to predict these things in the first place. And the biggest danger of this narrative is to depoliticize it. Of course, governments have a huge role to play to make people resilient, to build dams, to help people. There are very efficient irrigation systems that people can use to increase their harvest by using less water, like drip irrigation. So if you make those available also for smaller peasants, because that's the whole issue, of course, then you would make people much more resilient. So this is not to deny climate change, it's to make people resilient and to help people in a way to stay and to continue their livelihoods. And so we need to repoliticize this discourse, also based on the insight that those linkages are very complex. So what can we say? So any form of environmental stress, whether caused by climate change or not, has very ambiguous impacts on human mobility. First of all, macro studies have not found a significant effect of environmental stress on international migration. It is quite clear that most environmental stresses rather leads to local mobility. Some people may be driven off their lands, but those people are very unlikely to end up in another continent. Evidence from the literature on drought and natural disasters shows that most of those movements tend to be local and temporary, because most people are quite eager to stay in coastal and low-lying environments, because that indeed is where the fertile lands are. And the greatest victims, most likely, of climate change will be what we call the involuntary immobile, the people who will get trapped in dangerous situations, like Afro-Americans, poor Afro-Americans who got stuck into New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina, who didn't have the resources to move out of the city, who didn't own cars, who didn't have connections outside of the city, knew other people they could stay with out of the city, and these were the people who disproportionately died as well and lost everything. But it is a common story when you look at whatever kind of disaster, whether it's environmental or political or economic of nature. The biggest victims don't have the resources to migrate. Because migration is still being portrayed in this area as this desperate flight from misery. But particularly for long-distance international migration, the most miserable, the most desperate people don't have the resources to make that move in the first place. So if we're generally concerned about this whole issue of climate change, which I am, we should be concerned about the people who cannot move out and about protecting those people. So the link with mass migration is intellectually dishonest, but it's also leading to very different things if we think about policy. And of course, last thing about migration, yes, migration can actually be helpful as a strategy to stay in a way. And that's another thing we know, that many people use migration, particularly internal migration to big cities, as a way to diversify their income, to make their families back home more resilient, to build better houses, perhaps houses on stilts, or floating houses, or develop flood protection mechanisms, dams and things like that, to make themselves more resilient. And migration can help with that. So migration is rather a resource than this ultimate last-ditch effort. It's a very different way of thinking of migration we need to look at this issue. And yeah, of course, the better off have much better resilience to adapt locally, once again. So this is primarily, I think, an issue of poverty rather than of any other topics. So to conclude, the grand narratives about waves of climate refugees, going across the Mediterranean or pouring into the United States from Mexico are highly misleading and not based on facts. This mass migration is very unlikely, and the most vulnerable are most likely to get trapped in dangerous situations. And this narrative is primarily driven by very powerful interests like governments, international organizations, and ironically also humanitarian groups, like those 8 organizations talking about the human tide. I think it is a dangerous discursive game because you tap into the same narrative as the extreme right wingers using about the invasion. So you have to be aware of not tapping into the same apocalyptic language in a way, which contributes to the so-called securitization of migration. The idea that migration is this ultimate threat coming our way, diverting our attention away from political factors explaining people's vulnerability. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. It's very interesting. Thank you very much. So before you start thinking on your questions, and also those who are following on YouTube can put questions and comments on the chat. So feel free to ask. I do want to highlight some issues to open the discussion. So I mean you're well known for the studying migration and development, and I mean you're cited often in Mexican publications from Mexicans. It kind of like questioning, as Ron Skeldon says, that migration is development, but thinking and assuming that more development will actually reduce immigration, and you have studied a lot how complex this relationship is. So I think one of the first things that is very linked to that is the idea of root causes of migration that go on in political discourses. So I think maybe later if you can go back to how the US government or the Mexican government are actually using this idea would be interesting for us in Mexico. The other idea that we have discussed a lot also is this idea of crisis and waves and invasions and just like kind of like words and images that think or kind of like allude to mass migration and but also in a panic and threatening way, not only apocalyptic as you said, but I mean you mentioned in the book how how the use of maps can actually lead to or mislead to the idea that there is a big threat or a migration threat or an invasion. And I think it's interesting how we also in academia how we refer to these increases of migration. You are very clear in the sense that we cannot think of causal links and causal connections, but at the same time, it's very tempting to kind of like study drivers of migration and then try to isolate, I would say, like different drivers. So I think that's important. And finally, I think that some interesting work that you've done recently and that you've also been cited a lot is in these aspirations and capabilities framework. And so you're very clear in the sense that climate change, or let's say the degradation of the environment, will actually increase aspirations but maybe decline capabilities. And I think it will be interesting to think also, on this framework more broadly when we think on what drives migration or why people move, and who can move and who can actually is immobile and trapped and who's not able to move. And so I think this framework is useful. And I would say that, again, thinking of root causes of migration and how this is used by politicians, I think it's interesting to think if the capabilities are actually changed by the policies. We had actually one seminar in 2020 with Fernando Riosmena here in Colmex, discussing the evidence of climate change and migration to Mexico. And it was very clear that the findings actually showed that those who could migrate because of droughts or floodings were actually those in communities with very high social networks and connections with the US and just like facilitators to migration, but actually, as you mentioned, this immobility. And so I think it will be interesting in the future to actually see how aspirations and capabilities will actually change with, let's say, the degradation of the environment, and also highlighting immobility. So I think it's, I'll open the floor for questions and I'll take a couple of questions in order. Before starting the questions, I do have one question, because we wanted to make the connection with, so the CEDUA, the Center for Demographic, Urban and Environmental Studies, studies demography, urban studies, and environmental studies. And I don't know if you could mention quickly some of the the prior link of how you talk about that a lot in the book, but how population dynamics has actually been associated with climate change or with migration, to close this link. And I know that it was not the focus on this presentation to actually think on climate change as a result of demographic change. But I don't know if you could actually start by closing the three topics and then give everyone time to think on the questions. Okay.
Okay, I can do that.
You can do that.
I can try to do it. I think there's one thing I haven't mentioned, and that is the concept, perhaps it's a relevant concept here. It's used a lot, population pressure.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea, it's a traditional idea, it is called a classic push-pull model. Migration is often seen as a result of population pressure. Some linked to environmental pressure. Environmental stuff I've covered, right? Yeah. This idea that degradation will lead to more migration is more problematic, but I think it's equally problematic because it's a population issue. Is the idea that I think constant population pressure is very problematic because it creates an image that the faster the population grows, the more people migrate. Again, this is not what correlations show. Migration is actually highest in populations that already have a birth rate that is dropping. But the explanation is completely different. It has not so much to do necessarily with how fast the population is growing, but much more with this much broader development of society from a rural, agrarian, traditional society to an urban-based, industrial, service-based society, where we often find, and this I could link to this idea of aspiration capabilities. If that happens, more people have the resources to move, but also more people have the aspiration to leave traditional rural areas and move somewhere else. You can, of course, make a connection to population dynamics, and this is where Ronald Skelton has emphasized. It is not so much population growth, because actually the countries that have highest population growth, like in sub-Saharan Africa, have quite low immigration. Main explanation being they're quite poor and not well connected. So not many people can afford to migrate. And don't have the linkages and connections in education to aspire to migrate. Not have social connection network. So that seems to be logical. Where you could perhaps make a link with population, it is relevant how many young adults. So how big is this youth bulge idea? So it's not so much how fast the population grows, but if you have a high percentage of people who are roughly between 15 and 35 years old, that is typically the age at which people migrate, because old people don't tend to migrate much anymore. So that is the typical age at which people want to explore, may also be not happy about certain things, may have desperation and risk-taking attitudes that lead to a lot of migration. That can explain the paradox in Mexico, is a good example, or Morocco, or the Philippines, or Turkey over the last half a century. These were countries in full transition where birth rates already started dropping a long time ago, in the 1950s, 60s, 70s. They've really dropped to replacement levels now. How are they now in Mexico?
1.9.
There you go. Yeah.
National.
Yeah, so that is almost similar for any of those big emigration countries now. Their birth rates have imploded, but there is still a relatively young population coming into the labor market with higher levels of education, with more aspirations, who still don't find enough opportunities to match their aspirations. There, I think you have a clear link to population dynamics. But the traditional image, again, politicians will always talk this way: oh, Africa is going to triple its population, and it means we have this flood of Africans coming. But this is not really understanding how it works. There goes the title of my book. It's not like, oh, we have high population growth. It's like a toothpaste tube. It's a jet lag. So you squeeze out and people pour out. This is not how migration works. It's the same for climate change. Because the basic thing is agency. You need agency to migrate, which means you have to have the resources and the willingness. And that is why I have big issues with those terms, population pressure. This is not how it works in practice. So population dynamics do play a role, particularly when you have this demographic transition, and particularly the demographic transition where birth rates are falling, but you have a big cohort of young adults, then it's very likely you see these higher immigration levels before they start to tail off. Populations start to age themselves and countries start to become more. Is that an interesting question?
That's, yes, of course. Thank you. Just so that we can have the three. So I don't want to start with the questions and feel free to. Luis Jaime. Can you, ¿puedes hablar fuerte?
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Jaime, for your presentation. You have said that climate refugees is more a domestic or national, at last, internal migration issue than an international migration problem. So, from your knowledge about this topic, what could be a successful national or initiative to attend migration and climate change?
It is a $1 million question. Yeah, I think it is to focus. I mean, there's no easy answer to that, and I would be foolish if I would pretend to have the final answer on that. But I think the key thing I could say is create resilience and identify those populations who will be most vulnerable to the effects of climate change. This is most logically going to be the poorest, and those people who depend for their livelihoods on natural resources. So we talk about the small peasants in particular, for smaller farmers and fishers communities, these kind of communities. I think the responses couldn't have been national. It's really about, of course, on the global level, we have to combat climate change, it's clear. But some of, even if we follow the Paris agenda, there will be consequences. So we have to plan for that. And then I think the best you can do is to identify those populations who are most vulnerable in terms of where they live, so where there's flooding, where also the droughts may be more frequent in the future, and try to protect those populations. But I think you can link that quite easily to a more general policy to make people less vulnerable. So I don't see how you need a separate policy for climate in that sense. And the other thing is, yeah, creating, I'm from the Netherlands, we have a long history of creating defense, sea defense systems. Half of the Netherlands will be flooded tomorrow if we would stop pumping away water and break down the dikes. So, and then the response will be, oh, we're not the Netherlands, it's a rich country. And well, the advantage is we have time to adapt. And governments are serious about it. They could, of course, protect the communities. And I think displacement is the least desirable response, because there is another political agenda there. The Maldives are a very good example of a country that has argued that they need to displace their populations from small islands to a few central islands. There's a beautiful paper written about this. I could send to you. It actually shows that the real policy of the Maldives government is to convert those smaller islands that need to be evacuated into tourist resorts, because they have a big deal with the Saudi government or something like that. So, but those populations don't want to be evacuated from their islands. But the government wants all those, but it's too expensive, they think, because the Maldives is a huge archipelago with people living over dozens of islands. It costs them too much money to distribute all the government aid and resources over all these islands, so they want to basically dispossess native populations. And they use the climate change negatives. So it also shows the perverseness of some of this. So yeah, my response there again would be, if you're genuine as a Maldives government, yes, ask for international aid to try to protect those communities, to prevent erosion of those islands, and to make sure, flood protection systems could be put in place. People can live in houses that are less easily destroyed in flood.
And just to say, Luis Jaime is an expert in internal migration, so if you have questions on internal migration, you can ask him later. Ricardo.
Yes. Well, hello. My name is Ricardo Loy. I'm a student of the Master Degree in Demography here in the Colmex. In your presentation, you mentioned two natural disasters, floods and desertification. In your experience of these two phenomena, which one is the greatest impact on environment migration? And another question, what are the population points, if we can say that, most likely to generate environmental migrants?
The population points?
Yes, population points, like cities or...
Okay. I find it difficult to give clear answer, but I guess floods, because desertification is very much a man-made thing in many ways. If we see the role of water extraction by industrial use, and water scarcity is a very relative concept from that perspective. So if there's high usage, if there's high industrial usage or commercial agriculture, then of course resources get depleted, but it's less kind of a clear process that comes, is exogenous. In case of increased flooding, well, there is of course a human factor, like I was just showing in some coastal cities where land has been sinking. But of course, sea level rise is undeniable. It's sort of a global phenomenon that's going to affect many people, and I think the dangers are more immediate in that sense. So, yeah, and these will inevitably be, of course, high population density areas. These are cities. The paradox is that humanity has massively moved to all those places that are flood prone. All the more reasons to think about long-term responses to protect populations from flooding. I mean, I know that Indonesian government is planning a new capital now. It'll be an entirely different place. But I don't think it will be that Jakarta will disappear. But of course, we need to think about adaptive responses. Yeah.
And I would add that here in next city we have problems with water.
I don't actually have a question.
Can you speak louder for the...
I don't actually have a question. I'm Cristina Boyce, I'm a professor at CIDE here in Mexico City. What I do have is a thank you. So I'm the oddball out in the room, I think. I don't do migration research. I'm an environmental policy and conflict scholar. And I think one of the things we hear most often in narratives is, oh, flooding increases or drought increases. And as a result, we'll see migration. But the causal chain, as you mentioned, is much more complex. And the acknowledgement of that, and that those two phenomena are not necessarily climate change per se, but they're specific phenomena that can be addressed with policies, and we think it's largely. So thank you.
Yeah, I can only agree.
So I'm gonna take some questions from the people in YouTube. So first, Emilio Gonzalez, he works at UNHCR in Mexico, and he actually has a very interesting question. He's asking, what do you suggest to international organizations that work with migrants and refugees to better adapt the discourse? And that's the first one. And I'll go for the next one later.
Please stop peddling those narratives, right? And I talk also to people internally within UNHCR, and I notice many people within UNHCR that don't like UNHCR peddling these narratives. I think it's getting to the end of the credibility cycle, and I think it will eventually hurt UNHCR, because I'm not anti-UNHCR. I'm just concerned that these organizations peddle those narratives. They're creating the best evidence. I cannot look into the minds of the people who decide to continue those publicity campaigns, but I guess it's driven by the desire for attention by media and funding, but I think in the longer term it's self-defeating, because in this way UNHCR, the agency that's supposed to protect refugees, is actually peddling the same narrative that the extreme right is peddling about. There's simply too many people coming, we can no longer protect people, and I think that is the biggest danger. So I would rather advise UNHCR, I'm doing so online all the time, to stop peddling those narratives, because it's dangerous.
I thought you were gonna say with my book. I mean, there are many mentions about UNHCR. I would add, and I think it's thank you, Emilio, for asking the question, because I think it also talks about the interest of from people in the organizations to actually,
Yeah, I really
give a
hope.
better.
But I know that within these organizations, there are many people who also want to change this.
Yeah.
It's indeed. I hope they will become more powerful. And finally, that those organizations start to understand. It's like the yearly numbers, oh, it's the highest ever number, this or that. And I think, yeah, is that really a productive way of positioning yourself in the debate? Because it's only adding to this migration crisis. You were mentioning that this migration crisis narrative, which is not helping us to find any solutions. It's only added to this idea that this is getting out of hand. And I think the numbers speak a quite different story. This is what I tried to say.
So before going to one question online, we have Celia Toro with a question here.
Okay. Thank you for your very nice, interesting, very clear presentation. In this room, in that center, in this institution, many people have worked on migration, as you know, to the US, Mexican US migration. So it has been clearly established that it's people that want to go because they earn 5, 6, 7 times more for the hour. Period. And we know that very well. Over the last years, however, and securitization, meaning after 2001, oof, very, very serious, very problematic. But even before, in the 60s, 70s, the border out of control was part of very well established. But I have 2 questions. We have been hearing a lot about the dry corridor, Central America, Colombia, I don't know. Do you know of studies that make the same argument you're making with the dry corridor? Because we're waiting for this corridor to bring all these masses, so I wonder if you have something, because all your examples are from Africa, I understandably so. So one is if you can tell us something about Central America from that perspective. And the other is, I wonder if the narrative obviously doesn't lead to good policy, but I wonder if it hadn't led to countries, especially those with more resources, investing in trying to make people or to adapt better to climate change, without perhaps thinking that this will bring less migrants. It doesn't really matter what they think. But is there something in that direction? And the third, which is a very peculiar question of myself, but if we know that the tourists don't migrate because you need resources. If you know that development brings migration, people find better jobs, etc. Would you say that it's middle income countries and middle income people that will and are migrating these days? Is that so? Controlling for age, I mean, assuming the same age bracket.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm not a specialist in Central America, so for me it's very difficult to say anything definite.
Can you speak now?
Sorry, of course not that I know much more about Africa, even about Asia than I know about Central America. So for me it's difficult to give a sort of final answer, but I'm at least, of course, but I do read this area. I'm quite skeptical about it. I'd like to see more studies that really look at this seriously, because it cannot just be the only factor. I mean, if you look at this development-migration relationship, I mean, Mexico is a classic example of what happens to when a country becomes richer, that actually more people start migrating. And migration from Mexico seems over that peak point, you know, beyond some level of development, you see it declining, not stopping, but not be as high anymore. Yeah, just looking from a distance, I would say, well, Central American countries are basically following the trajectory that Mexico has gone through already. It's just lagging behind in that kind of development. It's of course not the whole story. Environmental factors may play an additional role, but just to reduce it to environmental factors, to me, based on evidence, based on theory, sounds not very plausible. I would really look at the broader developmental picture, and clearly you see a clear pattern that the share of Mexicans in US immigration has declined, and the share of Central Americans has increased, but it's not recent either. It's of the last 20 years already, I think. It's been a long, that fits totally within this idea that if you move from poor to middle income, you see more immigration to pressure. Second question. Of course, it doesn't mean that poor people don't migrate. We know that poor people do also migrate, and some poor people do make it over long distances. But on average, yeah, it's rather the lower middle classes, middle income countries that tend to be very overrepresented in most migrants, and of course, the highest skilled, more in general. So it's certainly not the poorest in that sense. Regarding your other question, that's an interesting one. Does the end justify the means? I think that's a good question. So the only valid counter-argument in a political field is say, well, we have to push this argument because it's the only reason to convince Western governments to pour funding into climate change mitigation.
I wouldn't say it.
Well, I've heard this. And I think, well, another big danger facing at least my own country, where a right-wing politician has won the elections, an extreme right-wing politician, I should say, this is an ordinary right-wing racist. I think it's not worth the price. I think it's too big of another risk that we may end up in totalitarian governments in parts of Western countries. I think that's a real risk if we don't. I think that's not a price I will be willing to pay. And I'm very skeptical that that is really the real motivation for countries to invest in climate change adaptation. So, yeah, I would then say, well, I don't think the end justifies the means in this case. But I do kind of understand the reasoning.
And the same for funding in academia. I'll not say more. No, I will say two things before going to a question from someone from Gisela Zapata. I mean, I think you're very clear in the book that, and going back to my question on root causes of migration and addressing root causes, you are very clear in the research and the evidence on migration and development, but also just thinking that if people from rural areas will have more money, then they will be more likely to leave. And so the idea that improving their conditions maybe will not be enough for them to stop migrating is actually very clear. And I have to say something from Central America. I mean, Guatemala, there are differences within Central America, right? So Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras are very different. El Salvador is going through an aging process that is much more accelerated than Guatemala. So in that sense, you could also expect more people, maybe more likely to live from Guatemala and different conditions, but you're very clear in how they interact in the book, also on how it interacts with the economy and other political factors and violence. And so thinking that people from Guatemala are leaving because there was a drought or there was a flooding is, again, simplistic, right? Where there are other causes, and migration from Honduras might be driven by political factors and violence and insecurity. And maybe, I mean, internally displaced people will be able to leave if they will have the resources. So kind of like this narrative again is not enough. Let me move to Gisela Zapata's question.
Can I make
Oh,
one?
yes.
Because it allows me to get back to the previous question. I think the biggest thing that is not being mentioned is labor demand in the US. And many people may have many reasons to migrate, and development may increase people's, or development and environmental stress can increase people's aspirations to move. But most people wouldn't do that if there was not this. We were
The
just
climate
mentioning.
change argument in Mexico has not been.
If there wasn't that opportunity to earn so many times more money in another country, and that country basically, despite all the narratives about cracking down on illegal immigration, basically tolerating people working irregularly in their economies, it's not going to stop. So I was also in Ciudad Juárez last year, and when you talk to people, I just had a conversation with some of you about that. Yeah, people would talk about problems. They live either in Mexico, Central America, or Venezuela, but they also talk about jobs, and that's not a lie. Youth unemployment is on a 50-year low. I think there's 10 million vacancies right now in the US. It's just crazy. And everybody knows it. It's kind of the elephant in the room, because that's what I find so problematic about the Biden administration root causes narrative, because it sounds very humanitarian. We know it doesn't work like that. If you develop the poorest, they will have more means to migrate. And secondly, it totally ignores the hypocrisy, I would say. Why not? The hypocrisy on the American side of the story, and a prime root cause of why people continue to move to the US is because you hire them. And you don't punish employers. I'll mention this afternoon. I was shocked when I found out how many employers get punished on a yearly basis in the US for employing illegal migrants. Do you know how many? 15, 20, without zeros added. And I think there's 11 million employers in the US. This is crazy. It's as high as the chance to be struck by lightning. And I think that's another reason why this environmental migration discourse, if the Biden or Trump or whatever other administration is running this argument, yeah, they're basically covering up what's really driving immigration. And I think that's another reason why I become increasingly impatient with this narrative.
There's a lot of hypocrisy.
Yeah.
So Gisela Zapata from Sadeplar in Brazil, she's asking, given the current adverse political climate in Western countries for any sensible discussion about migration, and with more and more governments literally chasing ghosts and amplifying known issues, such as stopping the votes or the Rwanda plan in the UK, what can we as academics do to help change this pervasive narrative, apart from producing strong empirical grounded research?
Write more
The
books.
role of academia.
Write more books. No. Well, that's one of the reasons I wrote my book, because I became more and more frustrated that this knowledge we all have, and it's easy to talk to you and a pleasure to talk to you, to share knowledge and to share perspectives. We learn a lot from each other, but how do we get this knowledge out of the ivory tower? That is the question that's been bothering me. It's also motivated me to write this book. Because I did not write this book for politicians at all. It was high-back and they wouldn't listen in the first place. Too many politicians have said to me, you do political suicide to implement your insights, so it doesn't help them to win the next election. They're going to just ignore it. And they know it's true. They know what we know is true, but it's inconvenient, so it's just being ignored. So I think academics should do better. I just published a working paper on the AMI website, where I try to outline what I think is the main problem, and try also to be self-critical towards academia. That we are very much l'art pour l'art, very much produce for our own circles. And this is how we make our careers. I understand this for junior colleagues who still need to make a career, but I think particularly for senior academics who have their job security, I think it's a real responsibility that we talk to the press, but also produce our own stories, and that we also think much more critically, how could we be more effective? And that is something I want to work on in the next year. So my book is in a way the first attempt to do so.
And I would add that, I mean, here we have academics from different universities, and then online also we have followers from different universities, but we also try to talk to international organizations and I mean colleagues who have worked also in humanitarian groups, as you mentioned, and I think it's what I think is that, I mean, our role as academics is to facilitate these dialogues within different actors. I don't know if you agree, but with based evidence and facts.
Of course, we need to do that, but I have a very great question, by the way, the way it was phrased from Sedeplar. I was there a few years ago. Very well phrased, that in the West right now, the debate has reached such a boiling point and polarization has become so toxic that I think this is from a European, North American perspective, that we can no longer afford to only talk with local groups, local organizations, policymakers. I think we need to be much more assertive in the political domain to really directly criticize our politicians and to, in a way, expose the hypocrisy, expose the lies we've been sold. From the left to the right, it's not just right wing, it's just across the political board. We've been telling nonsense stories, from the climate refugee issue to the migration are criminals issues, or migration take away jobs. We know it's all wrong, but in a way we need to be much more, I think, assertive in a way. And we have become very good in social sciences to state what we don't know, and we have all become very postmodern, but we have not excelled in expressing very assertively what we do know. Some things we just do know. What you were just mentioning, we do know that the prime driver of migration is labor demand, period. There is no long discussion needed. Without that labor demand, not that many people would have moved to the US. Come on. If the US would be in economic shambles, nobody would have showed up in the water. Or some people would have not in those numbers. And that is a simple truth that I don't hear enough. Because we've become so good in the details and all the methodological discussions. And we need to continue doing that within the ivory tower. But I think we need to be more aggressive is not a good word, assertive in stating what we do know and calling out politicians for what it is and just saying, well, this is hypocrisy.
So Nancy Landak was being very
This is
critical.
not going on, right?
Yes, Nancy Landak was being very critical as well. Working with different actors.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm an advisor for several nonprofits, and so I've sort of been in between with NGOs and the government as well. And so my question to you is whether you have any lessons learned or examples of how evidence does inform actions and policies, because it seems like NGOs sometimes are stuck in terms of advancing advocacy or evidence-based, either because of lack of capacity or not enough bridges between academia and NGOs. So if there's any lessons learned you have about how to advance that, I think that would be very helpful to build that capacity to have evidence-based and interventions and also in public policy agendas.
It's not $1 million question. Because the prime problem with NGOs and even I think organizations like UNHCR, because they're structurally underfunded. That's, I think, a political scandal. UN member states should, of course, just fund UNHCR decently, so dependent on basically contracts, the allocation of funding from the states, but the more that applies to NGOs. So it makes it really difficult. It is, I'm not sure whether this is an English expression, but it's difficult to criticize the hand that feeds you. So if you receive your funding from governments or other powerful organizations, it's very difficult to criticize them too directly. But even when I'm assuming that most people working, doing research for NGOs or international organizations are honest academics, along the questions are being researched is already very much, the questions are being seen as relevant to research, is already very much influenced by, of course, what is seen as important in politics. So the reason that the fact that the labor demand issue is barely having been studied over the last 30 years is speaking of governmental agendas. It's a totally focused, steer research away to other issues. But how to do it better? I had a colleague in Oxford, Oliver Bakewell, who said, it is so important to do policy irrelevant research. He worked a lot on refugees, in this case in Africa. He said, yeah, there's nothing wrong with doing super policy relevant research, but you only can follow the latest hype. You may not have sufficient distance to be really critical. And that's of course difficult to fund if you directly depend for your funding on a government or another organization. But at least try within an NGO to also isolate some resources to produce more independent research that is not primarily funded by an X or Y project. To put some resources apart, to save 10% of every big project grant to produce more independent research that is asking questions that governments don't want to see answered, that goes into a more critical direction. I think that's the only way to do it. And there I do think there is progress. I mean, the issue that we were talking about, I have been talking about, Claudia and I, for many years, I think the root causes narrative has been criticized so much now for the last 20 years that more and more people start to understand that it is more complex. But it is slow.
But the government still
Yeah,
putting it together.
but this kind of progress is, Max Weber said, change only comes by the slow boring of hard boards. And I think this is how it is. You would be naive to think, oh, I read a report tomorrow and politics is going to change. Because the political interests are so big that politicians will hold on to those narratives until the very last moment. It runs out of credibility. But we also see in also other policy areas that there can be change. There can be tipping points where the narrative suddenly changes. And then you need the science and then you need the evidence. So in that sense, don't get discouraged too fast and keep on working on providing broad evidence base. At some point, well, if I wouldn't be optimistic, I would stop doing all of this, of course, and become completely skeptical. But I think we need to speak truth to power. We also need to bring that knowledge towards broader audiences, because that is my worry about only talking behind closed doors to other policymakers and to other organizations. It's too cozy. Maybe we need to get out there and expose ourselves and say what we know, and writing books, op-eds, criticizing journalists, talking about the journalists. I've done a lot of work with journalists over the last year, and I also noticed journalists have very little time. That's why often when we read what journalists write about migration doesn't work, but in a way we also have a task to educate them almost, to work more with journalists and to inform them about it, so they can ask more questions. So there's all sorts of ways. There's no simple answer on that question, but I hope I get some ideas.
Yes. Well, I'll give to Ana before Francisco Alba. Just to say, Anna has organized a workshop with journalists here at Colmex, and we still saw some journalists talking about invasions and
It's long term.
Anna.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It was really amazing the way you question things that we have heard so many times. So that is very interesting. I want to hear a word or any thoughts on nearshoring. Nearshoring. This big issue that's coming, let's move the big centers of production to Mexico, for example, or to the Mexican border, instead of having workers going to the US and earning that kind of money. I think it's just part of the same trap. And also because they are going to have big environmental consequences, probably.
More generally, this is already a huge phenomenon. Export processing zones.
Can you speak a bit
The you talk about the maquiladoras, right? And the same happens in North Africa with export processing zones, but it even goes further now. Like some very powerful Dutch and American farmers are basically land grabbing. We've seen this in Ethiopia. They're buying, basically government is expropriating nomads who used to have their cattle graze there, huge stretches of steppe in the central river valley in Ethiopia, and putting those out on long-term leases to American cattle farmers and Dutch and roast farmers. That's another form of outsourcing, leading to huge environmental degradation, dispossession of native populations. And of course, there's a clear benefit of some important people in government to collect that money. And again, the production. When you buy roses, not only you can buy Dutch roses here, but when you go to New York, you can just buy Dutch roses. And most people don't realize those roses don't come from Holland. They were flown in 24 hours before on the 747 from Addis Ababa to Amsterdam, being auctioned in the big flower fair we have, flower auction, and then being flown to New York. And this is, of course, environmentally totally unsustainable. There's also a way of production that we see more and more happening, and obviously it won't stop migration. And I think particularly when you look at the structure of labor demand, is becoming less and less industrial, it's service-based, and it's not something you can replace with machines. Because who's going to take care of the elderly, the babies, the children sick in the future in rich countries? The same applies to Mexico, I think, in the future, if you look at Mexican demographics. So it's not some north-south simple thing. So it's a more general issue about labor. And yeah, it's very cynical. rich countries have done so far. It is not so much driven, I think, by preventing migration, it's just to bring production costs down.
Yeah, well, Mexico City has a TFR of 1.4. So in case you want to use it as an example, according to the last population projections that Victor estimated. Francisco Alba.
Well, I like your presentation, of course, and I mean, in front of us, too many things, let's put it that way, really too many things. I would like just to make a comment, and it has to do with and I like very much your stress on the complexity of all this, and I would stress also, if you want to do that, perhaps not, but you have enough time. I mean, to me, one of the most important things is the interaction that there are between these, I mean, you put out in terms, you have three, let's say, like dimensions, international migration, climatic change, and demographic dynamics, something like that. The interactions are really, really difficult. And in relation with your stress on the complexity, I would add something in the sense that we also need, and there is a reality, diversity of perspectives. I think that is also something that has to be taken into account. There are diversity of perspectives into the three phenomena, even into each of the one phenomena. And just because I have a lot of previous students of mine here, I would like also to make a commercial that has to do with publication. It's probably in the next couple of weeks or so. I just published something in the Migration Policy Institute. It's something on Mexico, and the title is something like that. Mexico at a crossroads. Mexico at a crossroads, en una encrucijada. Immigration making flat. Transit migration and immigration on the rise. That we probably in a few weeks. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, the interaction, I couldn't address that indeed. In my own research, I actually looked at this interaction. And when I first went to southern Morocco for my fieldwork, I still thought that, okay, this is about drought leading to migration. And then I discovered things are more complex. And then I discovered that most problems in agriculture often had to do with migration in the first place. It was because many young men left, there was no longer the labor force available, which meant that many families left agriculture, neglected the maintenance of irrigation systems, and why more and more sand started accumulating in the irrigation systems. Water was no longer reaching the lands. There was also a very complex ethnic hierarchy, which meant that the serfs and slaves that used to do the maintenance, once they migrated, no longer wanted to fulfill that role. So there's a whole social change linked to immigration that the former laborers no longer wanted to do that work, that also contributed to the collapse of those traditional systems. I didn't have time for that here, but it made me super aware of the fact that it's even more complex. It's not only the causal connection from environment and migration, it's incredibly complex. There's a reverse process as well, which is just one tiny example of dozens of examples you can give about how complex it is to be so careful with making those simplistic causal. So there's a reverse causality too, that's actually what you're trying to say. So the causality from climate to migration is already very complex. So there is environmental change, climate change affects environmental change, but many other factors affect environmental change than just climate. And then the effect of that environmental change on migration is very complex and indirect because there are other factors linked to migration. Then what you're bringing in, the migration itself influences those dynamics. Another dynamic in this case was some people use their money, their remittances, to build a few of those bigger farms. So to buy into the extraction of wild water. So remittance also has some negative impacts on the environmental. So it's very complex. Yes. There is no singular story to be told. Because in some cases, traditional peasants could use the money to continue the traditional agriculture. So it's very dependent on where you go, and what kind of oasis, what the ecological situation was locally. And that makes me so wary of these silly blanket statements about climate change and migration. If you're aware of the complexity, So thanks for bringing that in. I didn't have
The
time for that.
feedback.
I skipped those slides, but that's good. And we are Mexico at the crossroads. That is interesting. I mean, that would fit into the idea that this relation between however we define development and migration is complex and non-linear. So and Mexico seems to be at that tipping point. Another important country in the world is Turkey, roughly in the same situation as Mexico, where clearly Turkey has become, and then on the European side is already becoming a destination country. Not just for refugees, but also just for labor migrants. And demographically, I think it's almost similar. So they're countries that will attract migrants in the future more and more. And I'm curious how this will affect the debate. Because other countries had those transitions earlier. Southern Europe, I think, is the best example. How quickly people have forgotten their own migration policies and how quickly they start to adapt to same xenophobic rhetoric. Italy is a great example, and more recently now also Spain. They start to, I don't know, Mexico.
We can talk that later. I don't know if anyone else has questions here from the audience or from YouTube. No? Okay, we can still chat. There's some cookies and coffee that we can take outside because we cannot have it here. But before that, déjenme agradecer a todos por acompañarnos. Esta es la 11ª sesión del seminario Dinámicas Demográficas Contemporáneas del cuerpo académico. Wait. Don't stand up. Del cuerpo dinámica demográfica, el cuerpo académico de dinámica demográfica, realizado conjuntamente con el MIGDEP, con el Seminario de Migración, Desigualdad y Políticas Públicas. Si están interesados en más cuestiones de dinámica demográfica contemporánea, hay otros 10 seminarios. Y en ese sentido quiero agradecer tanto a Eric, Ana y Lidia por el apoyo para la logística y la organización. Sobre todo a servicios de cómputo y a servicios técnicos digitales por también permitir el cambio de sede, específicamente a Canek y Héctor, a eventos especiales que también se encargó de la organización y sobre todo el cambio. En ese sentido a Sara y Elizabeth, muchas gracias, y todo el equipo de difusión, Cristina Portas y demás áreas del Colegio de México. Y los invito a seguir otros eventos tanto el Cuerpo Académico de Dinámica Demográfica como el Seminario de Migración, Desigualdad y Políticas Públicas. Y a los que están aquí les invitamos un café y galletas antes de continuar la discusión a las 5 de la tarde para presentar el libro. Muchas gracias. Como que se le va Me encanta ver